What if one refused handshake could dismantle an empire built on greed, lies, and stolen dreams? When Celeste Vaughn, a brilliant black financier, was humiliated in front of the world, it unleashed a chain reaction that exposed decades of corporate corruption. But this isn't just a story of downfall. It's a reckoning with power, accountability, and the courage to rebuild from ashes. Stay with us as we uncover how one moment shattered a dynasty and sparked a revolution. 9 seconds. That was all it took for Celeste Vaughn to unravel the empire of Leonard Braxton, a man whose influence had towered over the tech industry for decades. Captured on camera at the prestigious Meridian Investors Forum, Leonard's refusal to shake Celeste's hand appeared, at first glance, to be a simple oversight. But to those who understood the invisible architecture of corporate America, it was a seismic revelation. The moment exposed far more than personal disdain. It revealed the quiet machinery of racial bias operating beneath polished veneers of professionalism. Leonard's instinctive dismissal of Celeste, a poised black woman with a global financial footprint, was not just about her presence. It was about the threat she represented to the psychological order he was determined to preserve. Decades of unconscious biases reinforced by boardroom dynamics and industry gatekeeping culminated in a gesture he did not even recognize as devastating. Corporate culture had long celebrated diversity on paper while maintaining unwritten codes that marginalized true disruption. Leonard, like many before him, had mastered the language of inclusion while resisting its reality. His company's diversity reports were impeccable. His stage speeches echoed with buzzwords like equity and innovation. Yet when faced with the embodiment of those values in Celeste, his instincts betrayed him. Social media transformed the incident into more than a personal humiliation. It became a rallying cry for communities exhausted by performative allyship and corporate double standards. Regulatory bodies, already pressured by growing demands for accountability, watched as public outrage outpaced formal investigations. The scene became a catalyst not because of its aggression, but because of its familiarity. Millions recognized in that handshake refusal the daily microaggressions that policies failed to address. What neither Leonard nor his loyalists understood was that Celeste had not stumbled into that moment. She had engineered it. With patience born of generational resilience, she had woven alliances, gathered evidence, and waited for the precise instant when systemic power could be made to falter under its own weight. And now the reckoning had begun. The Meridian Investors Forum, once the pinnacle of business networking, became a battlefield overnight. Within hours of Leonard Braxton's refusal to shake Celeste Vaughn's hand, the moment had exploded across every major platform. The clip needed no explanation, no hashtags, no narration. 9 seconds of raw, unfiltered truth had cut through years of corporate veneers, exposing an undercurrent the polished executives had long pretended did not exist. By midnight, the footage had been slowed, dissected, and magnified. Analysts on business networks debated whether the snub was intentional. Diversity advocates highlighted the deeper pattern of microaggressions black professionals faced. Social media users added their own silent testimonies, recalling boardroom slights, overlooked promotions, and patronizing apologies. The moment became less about Celeste and more about a universal exhaustion, a recognition of a system calibrated to exclude while preaching inclusion. Inside Braxton Enterprises, the panic was immediate. PR specialists crafted emergency statements, none of which felt sufficient. Leonard's usual tactics, polished apologies without real change, no longer fit the moment. The public had evolved. Outrage was now smarter, faster, harder to manipulate. Calls for boycotts simmered. Institutional investors, wary of controversy, scheduled urgent meetings. The company's stock dipped 6% before the Asian markets even opened. Celeste, meanwhile, moved in deliberate silence. She ignored the flurry of media requests, the offers for exclusive interviews, the carefully worded messages from executives pretending solidarity. Instead, she met quietly with her inner circle, a coalition of insiders who had spent years gathering intelligence on Braxton's empire. Among them was Tasha Elwood, a senior compliance officer turned whistleblower, and Elijah Grant, an environmental auditor whose reports had been buried by Braxton leadership. Their evidence was ready. Celeste's restraint wasn't hesitation, it was precision. While Leonard scrambled for damage control, the deeper cracks in his empire widened. The company's HR department received an anonymous leak of internal diversity reports, showing that while public diversity targets had been announced, actual leadership demographics remained unchanged for a decade. Beneath the press releases about empowerment and opportunity, the reality was a boardroom unchanged since the early 90s, overwhelmingly white and male. Financial regulators, already under scrutiny from a restless public demanding greater corporate accountability, took notice. Recent cases had shown that social pressure could accelerate formal investigations, and with shareholder value at stake, authorities had no choice but to act. Quiet inquiries began. Subpoenas were drafted. Braxton's offshore holdings, long hidden behind shell corporations, became subjects of intense examination. Meanwhile, at Braxton headquarters, the old machinery of self-preservation clicked into motion. Lower-level employees were summoned to compliance meetings. Security protocols tightened. Keycard access was restricted without explanation. Naomi Lewis, a black executive who had once been showcased as the face of Braxton's diversity efforts, found herself removed from strategic meetings with no warning. Her emails stopped receiving replies. Her assistant was reassigned. She understood immediately. She had served her purpose as long as the optics suited the company's narrative. Now, with authenticity demanded, instead of slogans, she had become expendable. This pattern, elevate, tokenize, discard, was not unique to Braxton Enterprises. It was a symptom of a larger cultural disease where diversity was celebrated in marketing materials but suppressed in boardrooms. Naomi's quiet erasure mirrored hundreds of untold stories across industries, a cycle newly visible to a public no longer content with corporate platitudes. Outside the high towers of wealth and influence, the ripple effects began to grow. Younger employees, emboldened by the moment, created anonymous forums to share stories of bias and retaliation. Hashtags linked thousands of experiences from tech interns to Wall Street analysts. Celeste's refusal to be diminished was no longer just a personal act of defiance. It was a signal that the old ways were vulnerable. In her private loft overlooking the Hudson River, Celeste reviewed the unfolding chaos with careful detachment. Every step had been anticipated, every reaction mapped. This was not a scandal to be survived. It was a system to be dismantled. Leonard Braxton had revealed more than his personal bias. He had unwittingly opened a door Celeste had spent her entire life preparing to walk through, and this time she was not walking alone. 3 days after the Meridian Forum incident, the cracks in Braxton Enterprises began to split into visible fractures. Celeste Vaughn's plan, built with the patience of a lifetime navigating hostile boardrooms, shifted into a new gear. The goal was no longer exposure, it was displacement. It started with the acquisition of Vertex Logistics, a critical technology partner responsible for Braxton Enterprises' supply chain software. Through a series of shell companies and silent investors loyal to Celeste, control of Vertex shifted hands almost overnight. The boardrooms of Braxton Enterprises buzzed with panic when executives realized the backbone of their global operations was no longer within their sphere of influence. Leonard Braxton, used to operating with impunity, demanded immediate action. His lieutenants scrambled to find alternative providers, but the intricate customization Vertex had built over a decade made quick transitions impossible. Every shipment, every inventory system, every project schedule was tethered to Vertex's platforms. The threat was clear. Celeste now controlled their operational oxygen supply. The financial markets reacted first. Analysts downgraded Braxton Enterprises stock, citing operational vulnerabilities. Hedge funds smelled blood and shorted the company aggressively. Within a week, Braxton Enterprises lost over $800 million in market capitalization. The collapse was not sudden, but methodical, engineered to erode confidence with every passing hour. Inside the company, fear metastasized. Naomi Lewis, increasingly isolated, watched as trusted colleagues were quietly reassigned or pushed out. Those seen as sympathetic to reform, especially black and minority employees who had once been paraded as evidence of Braxton's supposed progressiveness, became liabilities. Key meetings were rescheduled without notice. Project budgets evaporated. The chill was unmistakable. At the same time, leaks began to surface, strategic and devastating. Environmental reports hidden for years detailed how Braxton Enterprises had exaggerated its sustainability efforts. Carbon offsets, once proudly trumpeted at shareholder meetings, were revealed to be fraudulent, purchased through shell nonprofits with no real environmental projects. The news broke across major financial outlets. Public trust, already fragile, imploded further. Celeste's team weaponized narrative timing. They fed documents to investigative reporters who specialized in forensic financial analysis. Exposes highlighted the gap between Braxton Enterprises' public statements and private actions, drawing direct lines from press releases to suppressed whistleblower complaints. One particularly damning revelation involved a black-owned startup called Nexora Technologies. Documents showed that Braxton Enterprises had acquired Nexora under the guise of partnership, only to strip it for intellectual property, shutter its independent operations, and lay off its black leadership within months. The timeline left no room for plausible deniability. Every step had been calculated to present a facade of support, while extracting value and discarding the human capital that created it. The public response was immediate. Hashtags linked the Nexora betrayal to the handshake incident. Memes circulated comparing Braxton's glossy advertisements to the grim reality of their internal practices. Celeste had turned Leonard's greatest strength, his brand image, into his most vulnerable weakness. Regulators moved faster than anyone predicted. In an environment where public pressure could shift enforcement priorities, agencies had no choice but to launch preliminary investigations into Braxton's environmental claims and acquisition practices. Anonymous tips prepared months in advance by Celeste's team flooded hotlines. Internal sources, sensing the shift in power, began to defect. Meanwhile, Leonard resorted to old strategies. He authorized the surveillance of employees he deemed disloyal. He pushed the PR department to manufacture counter-narratives, suggesting that the backlash was the work of a coordinated smear campaign by jealous rivals. He approved confidential bonuses to key executives to buy silence. But the era of silent complicity was waning. Employees leaked emails detailing these efforts before the ink dried on the bonus checks. Naomi Lewis, caught between survival and conscience, made her decision. Late one night, she walked out of Braxton headquarters carrying a hard drive containing years of internal communications, performance audits, and concealed financial reports. She sent a single message to Celeste's private line, one she had memorized but never used. "It's time." Across the city, in a secure office she had prepared months earlier, Celeste watched the message arrive. She knew the moment was delicate. Strike too early and the system would close ranks. Strike too late and momentum would be lost. The time for patience was ending. The time for transformation had arrived. From the 28th floor of her office, Celeste looked out over the city, a city that had, for too long, confused proximity to power with power itself. A city that rewarded those who perfected the performance of change while protecting the architecture of exclusion. Leonard Braxton thought he was fighting a scandal. He didn't realize he was facing a movement, and movements once awakened were not easily extinguished. In a small loft crammed with old reports and faded photographs, Harper Braxton stared at her family's legacy laid bare. At 27, she had spent most of her life cocooned in privilege, shielded from the shadows her father's empire cast. But the walls were crumbling, and the truth could no longer be ignored. It had started innocently enough. She had been tasked with updating Braxton Enterprises' sustainability reports to counter the growing criticism. Buried in the files, she found inconsistencies, pledged donations to environmental groups that never reached their destination, audited numbers manipulated to show lower emissions, projects heralded as breakthroughs quietly shelved once the cameras stopped flashing. Harper pushed deeper, accessing archives few knew existed. She found acquisition histories marked with cryptic notations, minority-led companies like Nexora Technologies gutted for intellectual property and discarded. She uncovered internal memos instructing executives to suppress whistleblowers, labeling them operational risks. Each document stripped away another layer of the narrative she had once defended. The final blow came when Harper stumbled across correspondence between Leonard Braxton and Judge Ronald Carver, a powerful figure during the early years of the company's expansion. The emails made her stomach twist. They discussed the conviction of a rising black entrepreneur, Malik Jordan, whose company had threatened Braxton's early dominance. The tone was casual, transactional. Carver promised a conviction. Leonard promised political donations. Harper had grown up believing her father was ruthless but fair, aggressive but visionary. The reality was colder. He hadn't just played hardball. He had rigged the entire game, and others, like Malik Jordan and Celeste Vaughn's family before her, had paid the price. Across town, Celeste received an encrypted message. The sender ID was a simple H. Attached were excerpts of the documents Harper had uncovered, along with a single line, "I want to make this right." Celeste leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. Harper was not an obvious ally. Her bloodline was poisoned with privilege, her public image intertwined with Braxton Enterprises' false narrative of progress. But change rarely came from purity alone. It often required those complicit to cross the line, to betray the structures that once sheltered them. At Braxton headquarters, Leonard tightened his grip. Emergency meetings consumed every floor. Lawyers drafted statements. Private investigators were deployed to monitor potential leakers. The company's surveillance network expanded, pulling employee communication logs and access records. Leonard's strategy was clear: isolate, intimidate, and eliminate. But outside his echo chamber, the world moved faster. Anonymous forums tracking corporate corruption exploded with new leaks. Employees who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Whistleblower reports overwhelmed regulatory inboxes. A hidden tide of resentment, suppressed for years, surged forward. In a decisive move, Naomi Lewis delivered the hard drive she had smuggled out to federal investigators. The files documented deliberate greenwashing practices, illegal mergers, and manipulated audits. The submission triggered a formal inquiry, putting Braxton Enterprises under a spotlight it could not escape. Meanwhile, Harper prepared her own strike. She met discreetly with investigative journalists, handing over the emails that connected her father directly to Malik Jordan's wrongful conviction. She refused to go on record herself, knowing the weight her name carried, but insisted that the documents speak for themselves. The exposé dropped on a Sunday morning. By noon, headlines screamed across every major outlet. Braxton Enterprises linked to judicial corruption, systematic targeting of minority entrepreneurs. Harper watched from her apartment, heart pounding, as news anchors dissected every detail. The perfect family her father had spent decades crafting dissolved in real time. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the first stirring of something new. Not absolution, not yet, but the fragile beginning of accountability. Across the city, Celeste watched the news unfold. She recognized the magnitude of what Harper had done. It wasn't redemption, but it was momentum. And in movements, momentum was everything. The collapse had entered its next phase. By the time Leonard Braxton stepped behind the podium for the emergency press conference, the world had already decided his fate. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, each shutter a silent indictment. Across social media, the clip of the snubbed handshake now played side by side with headlines screaming corruption, fraud, and systemic discrimination. Leonard adjusted his silk tie, a habit born from years of commanding rooms. But today, no adjustment could shield him. His smile was strained, brittle under the weight of evidence mounting by the hour. His speech, rehearsed with public relations strategists until dawn, centered on familiar tactics: deny, deflect, denounce. He framed the flood of whistleblower revelations as a coordinated smear campaign. He painted himself as a victim of envy, politics, and a media culture obsessed with tearing down success. The performance might have worked a decade ago. It might have soothed shareholders during a time when image triumphed over substance. But the world had changed. Public patience for polished deception had evaporated. Every denial Leonard offered was instantly fact-checked in real time by thousands online. Every excuse was met with screenshots of internal emails, video clips of discarded promises, spreadsheets exposing buried fraud. Outside the building, protesters gathered, not in chaotic mobs, but in disciplined, strategic groups, carrying signs that blended financial facts with moral outrage. Diversity is not a PR strategy. You stole futures justice for Nexora. Their chants carried into the marble halls where Leonard tried to project authority, each syllable a reminder of his crumbling empire. Meanwhile, inside Braxton Enterprises, the boardroom became a battlefield. Half the directors demanded Leonard's immediate resignation, citing breach of fiduciary duty. The other half hesitated, calculating their chances of survival if they stayed loyal. The Securities and Exchange Commission had already launched a formal investigation. Subpoenas for environmental fraud and illegal acquisition practices were delivered hours before the press conference even began. The financial markets reacted with brutal efficiency. Braxton Enterprises stock fell another 15% by mid-morning. Institutional investors dumped shares in panic. Pension funds sensitive to public scrutiny announced divestments. Leonard watched the stock ticker on the back wall of the press room nosedive in real time. For the first time in decades, he looked genuinely afraid. Behind the scenes, Naomi Lewis moved swiftly, working with outside counsel and backed by secured whistleblower protections. She delivered sworn testimony and authenticated documents to federal prosecutors. Her evidence outlined not only Leonard's personal misconduct, but also systemic policies designed to suppress minority entrepreneurship under the guise of market expansion. Across the city, Harper Braxton's disclosures reverberated. The emails connecting Leonard to Malik Jordan's wrongful conviction dominated the news cycle. Op-eds flooded national papers. Corporate America's dirty secret, the systematic sabotage of minority-led innovation, was no longer whispered behind closed doors. It was printed in bold headlines. Celeste Vaughn observed it all with measured resolve. She had known Leonard would not fall with one push. Systems like his were built to resist, to adapt, to survive scandal after scandal. But this time, the structure was rotting from within. Employees defected daily, releasing new leaks, new proof, new testimonies. Legal firms once eager to defend Braxton Enterprises quietly withdrew their representation. Lobbyists and political allies erased connections overnight. When federal agents arrived at Leonard's estate with a warrant to seize electronic devices and financial records, he tried to invoke executive privilege, corporate protections, constitutional arguments. None of it mattered. His empire was no longer his to protect. As he was led away in full view of waiting cameras, a gust of spring wind scattered the carefully prepared statements he had once planned to use for damage control. The pages danced across the lawn like ashes from a funeral pyre. Leonard didn't look back. Maybe he understood there was nothing left to salvage. In a final act of irony, the clip of his arrest was paired online with the original 9-second video of the handshake refusal. The two images together told a story without words, the arrogance of unchecked power, and the inevitable reckoning that followed. Inside a modest office overlooking the city skyline, Celeste stood with Naomi and Harper. No grand speeches, no celebrations, just quiet, steady purpose. They knew this wasn't the end. Dismantling Leonard Braxton's empire was a beginning. The real work, rebuilding something better, was just getting started, and this time it would not be built on silence. 6 weeks after Leonard Braxton's arrest, the skyline outside Celeste Vaughn's window looked different, not because the buildings had changed, but because of what they now represented. For years, those gleaming towers had symbolized exclusion, hidden behind glossy mission statements. Now, slowly, something new was beginning to emerge. At the newly rebranded Meridian Equity Group, the first meeting of the Community Investment Council was about to begin. Unlike the polished boardrooms of the past, this space was open, light-filled, the long table surrounded by a cross-section of the city. Entrepreneurs from historically excluded communities, environmental advocates, tech innovators, even former employees once silenced by Braxton's regime. Celeste watched as they filed in, each one carrying the weight of battles fought and won. Naomi Lewis entered with a quiet confidence, the scars of her betrayal by Braxton Enterprises still visible but no longer defining her. Harper Braxton came next, her once privileged aloofness replaced by determined humility. Others followed, faces unseen in the corridors of power until now. There were no corporate platitudes on the walls, no marble busts of past CEOs gazing down in judgment. Instead, the walls bore murals created by local artists, each painting telling a story of resilience, justice, and transformation. As Celeste called the meeting to order, she outlined the vision that had driven everything from the first handshake that Leonard refused to the last file Naomi delivered to investigators. Meridian would not rebuild by replicating the old structures under a new brand. It would rebuild by shifting power outward, not upward. Profits would fund sustainable infrastructure, not offshore accounts. Leadership would reflect the communities they served, not just shareholders' demands. Innovation would prioritize social impact alongside financial returns. It was not just about dismantling corruption. It was about proving that ethical business was not a fantasy but a competitive advantage. That diversity was not a charity case, but a catalyst for better ideas, broader markets, and lasting change. The practical steps were already underway. Transparent hiring practices replaced secret referral networks. Environmental impact assessments were no longer marketing tools, but mandatory checkpoints before any new project. Partnerships were built with local organizations, not just national think tanks. Meridian launched a venture fund dedicated to supporting minority-owned startups, structured to prevent predatory acquisitions like what had happened to Nexora Technologies. Early grants flowed to environmental initiatives, educational programs, and tech incubators serving marginalized neighborhoods. But rebuilding wasn't just about policies and budgets. It was about shifting the psychological landscape. Celeste understood the invisible wounds the old system had left, the constant second-guessing, the fear of speaking up, the exhaustion of fighting battles no one else could see. She initiated leadership training programs rooted in emotional intelligence, implicit bias recognition, and community-centered decision-making. Board members underwent quarterly reviews, not just on financial performance, but on ethics, inclusion, and community impact. No one was untouchable. Not anymore. Outside the company walls, the impact rippled. Other corporations facing pressure from consumers and investors newly emboldened by Meridian's transformation began revising their own practices, some out of genuine realization, others out of fear. It didn't matter. The standards were shifting. The media that once chased scandal now spotlighted reconstruction. Profiles of Celeste, Naomi, and Harper appeared not as puff pieces, but as studies in how institutions could evolve if courage outweighed convenience. In interviews, Celeste refused to center herself as the hero. She credited the coalition that had formed, whistleblowers, community leaders, disillusioned insiders, as the true architects of change. Yet she also never romanticized the road ahead. Systems that had been built over decades would not transform overnight. Setbacks were inevitable. Resistance would come, sometimes disguised as compromise. The temptation to slip back into comfortable hierarchies would lurk in every board decision, every expansion plan. Change was not an event, it was a discipline. As the first council meeting ended, Celeste stood at the window again, watching the sunset bathe the city in gold and crimson. Naomi joined her, followed by Harper. "We'll be tested," Naomi said quietly. "We already are," Harper added, her voice steady. Celeste smiled, not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. "Then we'll pass," she said. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Not perfect, not fixed, but different. Because now power was beginning to flow in new directions, shaped not by greed or fear, but by the simple, stubborn belief that justice was not inevitable. It was built, choice by choice, day by day, and they had only just begun. Months after Meridian Equity Group's transformation began, the consequences of the uprising continued to ripple outward. Celeste Vaughn stood at the crossroads of victory and vigilance, realizing that toppling Leonard Braxton had been the beginning, not the end. A new problem had emerged, subtle but dangerous. Victor Miles, once her closest strategist during the dismantling of Braxton Enterprises, had quietly built his own network. Using shell companies and proxy investors, Victor began acquiring distressed assets tied to those who had enabled Braxton's rise. Lawfully, technically, but the spirit behind his moves mirrored the very predatory practices they had fought to dismantle. Celeste confronted him in a meeting room high above the city, the windows framing a skyline still haunted by old sins. "You're becoming what we fought against," Celeste said, her voice low, firm. Victor shrugged, a bitter smile on his face. "Justice isn't clean, Celeste. You know that. They didn't show mercy. Why should we? Justice without restraint risked becoming vengeance." Celeste understood this. History was littered with movements that began with righteous fury and ended replicating the oppression they sought to destroy. Systems didn't just fall because one villain was removed. They persisted when unchecked power shifted hands without a change of heart. "I'm not here to replace Leonard," Celeste said. "I'm here to end what made him inevitable." Victor's expression hardened. Their partnership, forged in common outrage, fractured under the weight of divergent visions. They had both sought accountability, but only one of them had committed to rebuilding something better, no matter how slow or imperfect. The rift wasn't public. Celeste didn't air betrayals, but quietly, she and her allies created new firewalls within Meridian, ensuring that no single actor, no matter how well-intentioned, could consolidate unchecked influence again. Transparency, decentralization, shared governance, principles etched into every policy. Meanwhile, Leonard Braxton's fate unfolded far from boardrooms and news cameras. A grand jury indicted him on multiple counts: securities fraud, obstruction of justice, environmental violations. A cascade of civil lawsuits followed, filed by former employees, minority business owners, and advocacy groups. His wealth eroded faster than even pessimists predicted. Offshore accounts frozen, properties seized, legacy charities severed ties. His name, once synonymous with success, became a case study in corruption taught in law schools and business ethics seminars. But for Celeste, Naomi, Harper, and countless others who had stood against the tide, justice wasn't a spectacle. It was a daily discipline. Every hiring decision, every partnership, every meeting where someone dared to suggest cutting corners for short-term gain. They weren't perfect. They disagreed. They stumbled. But the difference was simple. They held themselves accountable. Not when it was convenient, especially when it was not. In a quiet moment, standing in the Community Innovation Hub that now occupied the site of Leonard's first headquarters, Celeste reflected on the journey. The handshake that Leonard refused had not just exposed one man's prejudice. It had illuminated a system of power designed to exclude, exploit, and endure. They hadn't just toppled a king, they had cracked the foundation of his kingdom. And now, in the slow, often invisible work of rebuilding, they would prove that justice, once seized, must be renewed every single day.